this episode truly stands alone when it comes to Black Mirror episodes. There's quite literally nothing else like it. In being one of the longest inclusions in the entirety of the show, I was intrigued from the off. That paired with the concept, the leads, and the world that was created, this episode far surpassed my expectations. So with that, let's break down and explain the episode and call out any hidden Easter eggs. So let's get into it. Two individuals on a mission in space where it was crucial that the both of them stayed alive in order for it to be successful. However, a way in which they were able to stay sane was because they had replicas down on Earth which allowed them to go back home as and when they needed to, in order to be with their family. We saw that both Cliff and David were two opposite sides of the spectrum. David embraced the fact that he had a replica and treated it like it was just an extension of himself, but Cliff did the opposite. He didn't want to treat it like a human or even be intimate with his wife, and he lived a much more reserved life and was playing the waiting game until his real body came back down to Earth. The difference was perfectly mirrored during the opening scene where David was out and about, socializing and being noticed, whereas Cliff was inside with his family in a real remote area. Early on in the episode, David's replica was destroyed whilst he was inside it, and he had to bear witness to his whole family being killed in front of his eyes. This was because of a group of individuals which was led by Rory Culkin, who did a fantastic performance by the way, and they were against the development of technology, and they were fearful of what the eventuality of the progression meant. He believed that David's family were enablers, and contributed to the development. This meant that David was ultimately stuck in space on his own with no way of being able to go back down to Earth after witnessing the traumatic event. He couldn't attend his family's funeral and he was stuck on his own, losing his mind. This was then where we saw that Cliff was prepared to give up his replica in order to allow David to go down to Earth and spend some time in the forest to get some fresh air and to remind himself of what it was like to not be stuck in space. This was only for 1 hour a week. We eventually saw David and Cliff's replica go on to grow some kind of connection with Lana, Cliff's wife, and her have somewhat the same thing too. However, she was able to stop herself from being able to act on it. This really messed with your head as a viewer, and we kind of experienced it from the perspective of Lana, because it begged the question on if she was actually doing anything morally wrong if she were to act on her initial feelings. Technically, it is a replica of Cliff. It wasn't even a human version. However, it had a different mind. So it showed us that a connection does transcend more than physicality, and that it's about what's within, rather than what's on the outside, which is one of the main talking points that I feel this episode really wanted us to question inside of our own mind. With Cliff finding out how David was getting obsessed with Lana due to the drawings that he had of her in his quarters, and due to him confronting Lana, he rescinded access to his replica, meaning David was never going to be able to use it again. However, David saw a way around it. He faked an emergency which caused Cliff to come back, and whilst Cliff was out in open space with his belongings in the tray, he took his tag and went back to Earth. At this point, I thought it was going to be an ending where David would have killed Cliff by leaving him out there, and then gone back and spent the remainder of the time that he had with Lana. Due to his family being killed at the start, he basically said that he had nothing left to live for, so I thought he had the mindset that he had earlier on where he almost didn't see a point in sticking around. However, instead, David went back and butchered Cliff's family, just like what happened to his own family, making Cliff truly understand what it was that he felt when he suffered the ordeal, and what it was like to be up in space all alone and suffering. In the confrontation, David said to Cliff that he didn't truly understand how lucky he was, and that he didn't understand what he had. So by doing this, David made him realize how lucky he was, and that he took it for granted. Cliff was acting like he was going to change, but by then, it was too late. With Cliff finding the crime scene and waking up in his replica covered in blood, we saw the same reaction play out like what we saw when David's family were killed, with the camera rotating around and providing us different shots as they were fading in and fading out. It was actually quite an uncomfortable experience with the way that the camera was moving. The darkest part about this episode though was the fact that David pulled out a chair and got Cliff to sit down next to him, knowing full well that they both had to sit there working with one another for the next 4 years in order to survive. If one of them killed the other, then it was a death sentence, as 2 individuals were needed in order to survive. It had a white Christmas feel to it, so bleak, so intimate, and so tragic. With the song La Mer being played, which is a song that has been replicated so many times over the years, and in multiple different languages by different artists, it was a somewhat fitting track to have as the main motif for when a pairing would be made. For example, David and his wife, Cliff and Lana, and ultimately, Cliff and David. Now let's move on to the Easter eggs. This episode was one that felt as though it had the least amount of Easter eggs inside of it. One Easter egg that we saw was on the listings outside of the cinema. Most of the movies that were there were to represent the time period, with them coming out in late 1968 and 1969. But on there as well was Space Fleet, the show that Robert Daly was extremely obsessed with in USS Callister, so there must have been a movie made in the 60s. Within the newspaper where we saw that David's family were killed, there was the white bear symbol present, which could end up being one of the earliest uses of the symbol, which is quite interesting. The bookshop that they went into in the episode was called Cooper's Bookstore. I don't really know if it's worthy of being an Easter egg, but Cooper was the name of the individual who partook in the trial for the episode playtest in Season 3. I wouldn't call this an Easter egg, but this is something that definitely deserves its own individual call out. The fact that Henry was present in the entire episode but didn't really say much. We saw Henry as more of an observer, and I think that was because he knew that the person that was inside of his father's replica was not his actual father, but instead somebody else. Hence why we saw him acting up around him. Cliff and Lana thought that he'd be able to be fooled, but he definitely knew what was going on. There weren't that many Easter eggs in this episode, which was a shame, but do comment down below if you spot some that I might have missed. Thought this episode was a really good one. It stands out as one of a kind, as there's not been a Black Mirror episode before with the level of depth to it that this one had. It was a true sci-fi story, one that was in space, and I liked that. The technology was so interesting too. I actually thought that the link technology that was being used was a possibility in this episode when I did my trailer breakdown, so I'm glad that it was that, as it was such a cool concept, a concept that we've not seen before. The way that this episode was shot was truly nice on the eye as well. I don't think that it was shot on film, but the way that it was edited gave it the illusion that it was. The time period that it was set in is something that I feel also allowed it to have that feel as well. Aaron Paul and Josh Hartnett really did deliver some of the best performances in the entirety of the Black Mirror show. The relationship that the pair had and the range of emotions with the gradual decline in the sense of care felt so real. The fact that Aaron Paul had to essentially play two different characters whilst being in the same skin was really impressive too. I genuinely believe that there was a version where he was David and a version where he was Cliff, so it was truly top notch. This isn't an episode that you'd just throw on. It's an episode that I feel you'd try and give as much of your attention to as possible, and I imagine when viewing, you're in it for the long haul as well. As I mentioned, it's in the same category as White Christmas and Black Museum, two fantastic episodes. I feel Beyond the Sea definitely deserves to be up there alongside it. I'm a massive fan of this episode. If you take these first 3 episodes of Season 6 and compare it to the 3 episodes that we had in Season 5, it really does feel like Season 6 is on a different level. So, there you have it, Black Mirror Season 6 Beyond the Sea Ending Explained. If you want to see more videos such as Endings Explained, theories and predictions and character breakdowns, then click on the I button. Or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. If you'd like to give me a show or movie that you'd like me to review, then head over to my Twitter, @brainpilot_, and tweet me what show or movie you'd like me to review next. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rate the latest movies that don't quite make the cut to getting a dedicated video, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. It's where I rate the latest releases in real time. What did you think of this episode? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.